Hey guys, welcome to a special 11/11 episode of Art of Law. Mark, do you have any plans for Singles Day?
I'm not single, Sean. So I didn't even realize it was Singles Day. But I always thought it was one of the saddest things was the like Singles Days. I guess it's like the reverse Valentine's Day where you buy presents for yourself because you're alone and single.
Well, I've always thought of you as a eligible bachelor, Mark. Maybe
Oh,
next.
thank you. Okay.
All right. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. This is not a tip. We don't want it to be like a typical preachy webinar. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and put it in chat. I try to slot them in when I can. And of course, everyone who registered will get a copy of this presentation and also a link to the YouTube channel. And in this on this slide, when you get the PDF, you can click on this link and it'll send you straight to our YouTube page to see the previous episodes as well. On today's episode, I wanted to break this up into three parts, Mark. Then and now, a little bit look into the past, which is what we usually like to do, considering your long history of dealing with China, sourcing challenges, and then, of course, the new sourcing issues that are kind of on the forefront of today's China. So let's just start off.
Oh, me. Oh, right.
Yeah, I pulled this from a photo book of you that you left behind. You've been traveling a lot. You've been around China. You've seen how it goes in terms of sourcing and supply lines. Obviously, before you were a lawyer, you were heavily into trade. But maybe I just want to pick your brain a little bit because you have been around for quite some time. Just what are your general thoughts on how sourcing, supply, production, these types of things have kind of changed before your eyes?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's really changed for my eyes. I think when I first got to China, there was, obviously China was back in the 90s, it had started to ramp up, but it was that more cheap, made in China was perhaps a cheap kind of idea, where now also Chinese consumers, they were probably the last to adopt made in China, but now I think, it's really considered quality products. So I think that's one thing. A thing which has always kind of struck me as a lawyer is that a lot of foreign companies would spend lots of money, like setting up a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, getting lots of legal support for a small investment with hardly any people and not much complexity. But on the other hand, they'd be doing millions of dollars worth of sourcing on contracts written by an engineer with an unenforceable agreement, no due diligence on their big supplier. So it was kind of a bit strange how, establishment of an entity is a big deal, but somehow sourcing didn't seem to be a big deal for people.
And so with that said, I think, for the next slide, kind of seeing where it's going. And I think, there was this in the news for anyone who's following the 5-year plans. And Mark, you've been around for a couple of these 5-year plans now. So in this iteration, there's a concept of dual circulation, which is that there's a domestic circulation and international circulation with, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's looking, this 5-year plan seems to be looking more inward. So it's focusing more on the domestic supply, not just supply chains, but of course, including supply chains, but looking more domestically, more internally. On the graphic on the right is more of a general, major targets of this 5-year plan. But obviously, we want to talk a little bit about what does that mean in terms of production and supply chains. So, Mark, how do you, maybe you can give us your insights on how does this 5-year plan compare to the previous ones that you've been around for? And is this kind of what you have been, does this not really surprise you too much?
No. So I think like the dual circulation thing's been around a bit longer. I'm surprised it's only early 2020. I thought it's been around for longer than that. And so I guess, early on, China used to get special benefits and you were able to set up a wholly foreign owned enterprise if you were export orientated. But nowadays, I think, people think the real market is the domestic market. But I think, one thing which is perhaps not reflected here is that the Chinese government, they're putting a lot of effort into things like vocational training and things like that. So I think when they even talk about R&D and this kind of R&D stuff, it's not all about like TikTok or, buying stuff online. It's about being a manufacturing power. So I don't think they want to have their manufacturing hollowed out. And I don't know if this is going to be on a later stage slide, but something which people be talking about back even when SARS hit. So I don't know, that's like 15 years ago or something. Yeah, people always talking about the supply chain has to move out of China, or people will have a second one. That never really happened. And we've got clients who do sourcing in China, and really, I think I can only think of one client that really made a big move of moving part of its supply chain out of China. And I think, with COVID, there was all the talk about PPE. You should have some within your own country, not just outsource it to China. But very little has happened. I mean, I know the Japanese put a lot of money into reshore. I don't know what happened with that. But I think if you look at the American or the European supply chain, you read a lot about it, but you never see it in real life. And it might be just that we've got clients which are different, but probably the media or these other law firms are exaggerating it because it's difficult to believe that, our clients are behaving so differently from everybody else.
Yeah, actually, to that point, I was doing some research in preparation for this, of course, and I found this really amazing article that was talking about, it had a lot of statistics and things like that, and it was talking about diversifying the supply chain and away from China. And then I thought, wow, this is really good stuff. And then and then I read the date, and it was like I don't want to say 15 years ago, but it was like 10 years ago. And I was just like, well, this this is like you said, it just reminded me that this has been kind of discussed probably for a long time, but just practically for one reason or another, things have always been kind of stayed the same. I just want to point your attention to one thing, Mark, and this will be, I don't think I'll bring this up again unless there's any questions from the chat, but if they're looking from an external point of view.
Oui, en fait, je retire les joints en fait en desktop et je grave.
Okay, sorry, I muted that person. Yeah. Okay.
All right, sorry about that. So looking outward for a second, number 7 here on this graphic is talking about Belt and Road. So I think we'll talk a little bit about just China for this episode, but just to get your quick thoughts on what does sourcing and supply chain mean in terms of Belt and Road for you?
Nothing. I mean, I've never been touched by Belt and Road. I mean, I think it's a nice story, but it doesn't really affect us. Our clients are, European or American or, other countries. I'm sure Belt and Road's interesting, but it doesn't seem to have that much traction. So for me, to tell you the truth, it's had no real impact on my life. Maybe the fact that the trains are going to be running better to Europe, so people will be able to use train transport rather than sea. That might be kind of interesting, but I don't think it really affects our clients.
Yeah, and I think the domestic circulation is probably the more interesting part about this. But of course, one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about supply chains is because it's all in the news, right? And it's not just the China issue, it's kind of a global issue. And I guess one of the themes that we'll be talking about today is, of course, COVID. But this supply chain issue, while it might seem like a kind of an independent issue, it does stem from that COVID, that COVID spark. So we have here supply chain issues in terms of ports. We have someone sent one of the people emailed me saying wanted to ask about the electric plants. And of course, we still have COVID, which is of course affecting air travel and everything else. So maybe just get your quick thoughts, Mark, from a current day perspective. What do you think about the sourcing in relation to these types of issues? Do you think these are long-term trends, short-term trends, or issues, or just your thoughts?
Okay, nobody would know. I can't imagine anybody knows. So, I'm in London at the moment, and I thought, with COVID, I think when that hit, and it hit pretty hard everywhere, you were thinking that probably the result will be mass unemployment, like a new depression. But it's actually the opposite in many countries. A lot of the supply chain chaos is, at least in Europe, but especially in the UK, is there's no people to drive the stuff around, and there's factories that don't have enough people to work. There's abattoirs that don't have meat packers and stuff like that. So it's kind of strange. You thought there's going to be mass unemployment. There's actually not enough people to do the jobs which people need to get things done. And so I think, China's been, pretty stable throughout all this. I know that there's those energy requirements, etc. But life is too easy. And I think, in the West, people like just to do what's easy. So it's easier to buy your plastic, Christmas trees from China than, somehow build a factory to make plastic Christmas trees, in the UK. So I think it's a bit of a bump, but it's also probably something that will be corrected pretty quickly. But I don't see how people can distance themselves from, China. So I think globalization's here to stay. I mean, COVID, made it short, but everything you've seen, they haven't done anything yet. Governments, they talk about, PPE, but that doesn't happen. So, once it's over, people will just go back to getting the stuff made in China or elsewhere, I would think.
Yeah, history tends to show that. All right, so let's get to the nitty-gritty then, the sourcing challenges. And I think these are more evergreen issues. So we'll talk in the third section, we'll talk about the future issues. But I guess number one, Mark, and there's no IP strategy. So, if you're sourcing from China, how important is having an IP strategy for an international company?
Yeah, so I think it's I think it depends. There's lots of different ways of sourcing. So I think this might be the kind of outsourcing. Like PPE is normally just supply companies buying something which hasn't got their brand on it. So that's something where IP, you don't have any IP, so you don't have to worry. You just have to worry about quality and things like that. But I think there's a lot of people like I guess Adidas and Nike and all those guys. They don't own the factories anymore, as far as I know. They just outsource it to OEMs. We've got clients who have a lot of linen made in China. We've got clients who have many products made in China. And so I think, first thing is the trademarks. You really need to register your trademark, even if you make it within China, because just making it within China can be an issue, even if it's only for export. And registering trademarks cheap, so do it early and often. Patents, again, relatively inexpensive. So I think all these things are important because leakage will be an issue. And then I think one thing which people may not realize, most countries have a system where the customs will check for pirated goods coming into the country. China is the rare country which the customs officials will check whether the goods leaving the country also have IP infringements. And so we've had a number of clients who've done it, everything ranging from a power tool to a binocular. And, occasionally they get a flag from a customs authority out in Chongqing or something saying, hey, there's a shipment of suspicious looking stuff. Is it yours? So it's very cheap and it might be a cost effective way. If you're Apple, Apple would spend a lot of money, teaching the customs officials, and they would also know where these kind of pirated goods are being routed. So they would know which ports, but most clients wouldn't have those kind of resources. So I think, enforcement can be difficult in China. I think it's going to be difficult everywhere. But if you don't even secure the IP rights, you just make it impossible. And in fact, you even make it possible, because a lot of people who do sourcing in China first, then develop a market in China. And, the worst thing is, because, there's that, I forgot what it's called, but something like make it and ship it or something. There's a better word for it, but people have been making stuff in China for a long time for export, and then they find out there's a big market for down jackets or something, but they haven't registered the trademark, and they've got problems then, penetrating the Chinese market, going from sourcer to actually supplier. So so in a nutshell, it's cheap. You should do it as soon as you can, and you should definitely do it before you start having somebody manufacture for you.
Yeah. A quick question about the customs procedure. So you would need to first register the IP in China, and then once you get that,
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'd have for trademarks or for patents. So you just register them first, which is cheap. And I think the customs registration is like $1,000 or something. It's like, small money.
And like you said, the issue one was mostly, if you have some proprietary IP that you want to protect, but this number two, which you don't know your suppliers, is more universal, I guess. Yeah, Mark, what do you think about, how do you get to know your supplier, and what kind of basic due diligence should one, go about in order to kind of confirm or what they believe to be as a good, worthwhile supplier?
Yeah. So I think we've been saying this for a long time, and people don't really do it. But I think now history is catching up with people. So, for example, in Germany, they've got a new supply chain law, which is about a compliant supply chain. And we've got a client, a US company, they also want to have a green and sustainable supply chain. So they have to know. And I think, firstly, there's going to be things like the German government, which I guess will influence, all European governments about the compliance in the supply chain. It can't be that you just say, I don't know where it's being made. So, there'll be questions about, are the suppliers, paying the minimum wage? Are they using child labor? Yeah, most of those things. I've never seen a case of supply of child labor in China. So I think that's probably a bit of a media beat up story. But, there are suppliers that use prison labor and things like that. And it can't be enough to say, I didn't know, or, just at some stage, the Chinese supplier wrote this letter to me and said, I don't do any of these things. So I think, in this new world we're moving into, I think environmental compliance will be important. And so I think the list there, it's about labor, social contribution, IP, environmental. Sanctions could be a new thing, also getting ahead of political things. So now I'm just talking from a Western company perspective. It might be important that they don't suddenly wake up one day and see that they've got a supplier who is, politically compromised. So I think those kind of things are things to check. The old stuff about, the size of the company and things like that, that's probably just to make you feel that it's a real company, that it's valid. We did a small due diligence on somebody. They wanted to get their new supplier, and they said, oh, we want to change the contract. And I said, well, you got slightly bigger problems, because actually the company that you want to do the contract with doesn't exist anymore because it was wound up for bankruptcy 2 years ago. So, so I think, there are things that you have to check and, do those kind of things.
And I'm curious about the quotes there on the bottom of the slide, Mark. Are these real quotes that you've this slide, of course, Mark contributed. Are these real life quotes that you've heard from your clients?
Yeah, I think probably the excellent guanxi, it's always about, so people having relationships to get things through ports. But it's not normally that kind of guanxi, it's normally other things. I think there probably, I don't know if it's in another slide, but I have them right where I want to be. I'm their major customer. What can they do? I think, this is a big issue. And we do have a client at the moment. They want to actually, and I just said nobody wants to resource. They want to actually bring back some of their production, or because they're expanding the business, they're an American company. They are very reliant for one large piece of the production on one Chinese vendor. And so it's a critical piece. And so part of the thing we're helping them with is they want to actually set up in the US a second thing. And interestingly enough, they want the Chinese customer to help the Chinese supplier to do this. So I don't know what his motivation will be, but we'll see. But I think the problem is sometimes people think, oh, I'm their biggest customer. What can they do? But if you've got a problem with your supplier, the problem is they're your biggest supplier. What can you do? So if you can't meet your production, it's a symbiotic, mutual assured destruction. And I think the thing is, if they're good, and now we've got the shortages of supply, they are probably going to find it easier to find new customers than you will be able to find a new supplier. So that's the kind of issue. And then, I got them right where I want to. I think one of the other things with suppliers is, it's all difficult, and people think it's not. They just think it's very simple. So, for example, it's very often with the smaller suppliers who are still ambitious, and they're private entrepreneurs normally, that maybe the foreign company will provide them with financing or loans, or they'll pay in advance, different things, to do the molds or the tooling, depending on the type of product. And this can be quite a lot of money, or they will require the supplier to build a new factory or something. And then I guess the problem is, legally you can have the contract, you can just stop it, but feasibly, will they really stop manufacturing your product in the factory which they've just built? Will you get your tooling back? It's these kind of things. So, of course, contracts are important, but you also have to be realistic about, what can the contract do? Are you making a strategic mistake if you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and, you're asking someone to build a factory very specifically for your special product? If you default on him, how could he stop making that product? He'll have to go to a competitor or start making it himself.
Yeah, and also it goes back to that protecting your IP point too. Challenge number 3 that you don't know yourself, and this is exactly what I think you were talking about, Mark, is it's not what they can do, it's what can you do. Before you find yourself in that situation, maybe there are some things that one should look inwards and try to find out, what are their weaknesses and advantages. So we have a list here, but maybe you want to just quickly run through these.
Yeah, so I think it's difficult with sourcing. I think and COVID has made things more difficult. So people can't visit; they can't visit the factories, and so I think if you don't have an entity or people in China, you probably have to outsource something. I mean, at least have somebody occasionally knock on the door of the factory and look at the products and just have a look occasionally. I think this will get better once COVID retreats again. Finding the supply on the internet. I talked yesterday to somebody, and they've got an entrepreneurial business that's doing well. I'm sure it's small scale, but it's a type of undergarment type of product. They said that they're getting it made in Hong Kong, and I mean the chance of anything being made in Hong Kong is very small. So that means they don't actually know where it's being made. I'm sure it's made in somewhere in the mainland. Look at your product. Does it have particular problems? Is there something which will cause you a problem with it? What's your leverage? I think that's what I was talking about before. Just relying on the contract's not good. The best relationship you have is where you could move your supply chain to a number of different factories, because I think the old kind of adage is the first time you have a contract with a Chinese supplier, he does a fantastic job. Second time, third time is good. And then by the fourth time, he's already looking for somebody new. So he's lost interest. He'll continue, but he doesn't put his, best foot forward. Sorry, I don't know if you heard that. That was my dog. There's a drill, and then he starts to pretend he's a wolf. So I don't know what he's up to.
I think he's very
So I think the procurement team, very often they can be, a corrupt team. So, making sure that they don't get too close to suppliers. That's what I said there about whether it's reasonable to expect them to invest in production lines and then just at your willy-nilly drop of a hat, you say stop producing, that they will. And so they're the strategic decisions, splitting up the procurement. sometimes people will just have a component. They might keep a special component overseas and then just supply it so that nobody can just totally create the whole thing. But of course, there are costs. It's normally cheaper to get one person to do everything if you're in the packaging. So they're the kind of questions to ask yourself strategically, I think.
This is very good. I think, one of the things that we like to kind of to highlight when we do this, do this series is, of course, Mark, you're a lawyer, but there are a lot of practical and strategic decisions that go beyond just looking at the contract. But with that said, we should probably still mention the fourth and final issue here, which is a challenge is, just having bad contracts. So of course, one should look, register their IP, register customs, look at their leverage, and make strategic decisions about maybe possibly splitting some of the, supply and procurement process. But of course, inevitably, Mark, the contract is still a major factor here. So I know you have some interesting views about the contract, so I'll just let you get on your soapbox.
Okay, thanks. So I think, look, I think there was a question from somebody about whether they should just use the HQ template contracts. Typically you can, because if there's a foreign party and a Chinese party, you can choose the foreign company's law. So that's not a legal issue. The question is whether it's always good, because there are issues. If you're going to enforce the contract, probably you'd prefer, honestly, if it's really quite a simple supply contract, you probably would be better off with Chinese court litigation rather than arbitration, because arbitration still has to go for enforcement, through the Chinese court system. So I think, maybe look at the contract and do it. I'd say, look, contracts, they should be more simple. I think, in two ways. I think the contract terms don't need to be as complicated as people make them, but I think the annexes should be more complicated. So, I remember once we had a case where a Swiss company was buying some stuff, and the Chinese company had used, let's say it was a type of wire. And for the Swiss company, it was very clear that you had to have a certain quality level of wire, whereas the Chinese company just thought, well, this wire is cheaper, so we could use it. And it's difficult to win in litigation anyway. But if you look at the contract, there was nowhere in the contract which specified the type of wire. So that should have been something in the annex where you would specify things, very, strictly. Because I think the Chinese party wasn't probably acting in bad faith. They probably just didn't know, it was not their product. They were just putting it together.
Yeah.
So I think, we've also seen, contracts signed and, it's not clear who the Chinese partner is. It's only in English. They have an English name, but a lot of Chinese companies have like 12 different companies, all with very similar names, and the English translation looks exactly the same for all of them. So it's important to have the Chinese name, but also perhaps the registration number, the address, and also have it executed. How often have you seen a contract signed by Tony Wang? Nobody knows who Tony Wang is. Who's Tony Wang? So the company seal is an important thing. Legal rep is great. But make sure the contract that you've tried so hard to get over the line is actually signed. So I think that's important. And then I think,
one question. I have one question, Mark. If anyone has any questions, you could feel free to put it in the chat or just send it to me directly. But I have a direct question here from one of the viewers. So just a kind of I guess this is kind of a very simple hypothetical, but if there was if there were orders that were confirmed by the Chinese supplier to arrive, outside of China by a certain time, but it does not arrive by that time, who will pay the the customer's losses, and what are the what kind of penalties should one look for? I don't know if this goes to your point about it's, you can have a contract under UK law, but when it comes time to enforcing it, well, then that's a whole separate issue altogether. So, in this very simple, hypothetical, what kind of advice would you normally want to, give?
Yeah. So I think in that specific example, there's two dangers which people often, if the contract's not drafted, and I don't mean it has to be drafted very beautifully, but if it's just drafted, badly, you have the following. So I think you said you have a Chinese supplier and you've got a bunch of contracts with them, and they've delayed. So there's a delay of a few of those contracts. So if you don't have an overarching contract, like a framework agreement, which can be a simple agreement, each of those contracts is a standalone contract. So the fact that he's in delay doesn't really strictly, or at least it's very arguable, doesn't give you the right to cancel the other contracts. So you might be in a really difficult position about, how that works. And so, I think so it's important to have like some kind of framework agreement, because normally people do purchase orders, but if there's no framework agreement, then each little purchase order is a separate contract. So, how do you cancel them? About the kind of damages, this is always difficult because, if you're a big company, let's say you're a medium-sized company, but you've got a big customer, you've got a Walmart, or you've got a Carrefour, or you've got, someone like that, they'll have all these very tough provisions on you for delay, and you'd like to pass that on to the Chinese factory. Problem is, firstly, do you put it in the contract? But even if you've got it in the contract, can you really make the claim? Can you really get the money? And so I think that would go into the factor about whether the supply is difficult and the overall risk. Because I think, contracts are important, but the contract can't, magically change a situation. So I think you have to really think about the risk you're taking on, because probably if you are located in Europe and you've got a contract with one of the biggest, European customers, and if you've got a big relationship with them, you'll be in trouble with them and you're going to have to give in. But if it's a Chinese factory, how do you do it against him? He'll just go away, and then enforcing it, if it's in the contract, it's all difficult. So I think that would go to your risk profile.
Yeah, and later on we'll get into, or actually right here, I believe it's in this section, but you don't want to damage that relationship too, especially if you are their biggest, or if they're your biggest, supplier partner. By objecting to the delay or something, if it's minor, it might jeopardize some of the future relationship too. So it is, beyond just the legal, it does get a little bit more, interesting to think about, because there's obviously a relationship.
I don't think anyone cares. I don't think anyone pulls out the contract because there's a few hour delay or something. I think it's really the problem which the person who saw, I didn't see the comment, but yeah, it sounded to me, it's like the guy has got a big bunch of claims from his customer, and then how can I pass it on to the Chinese factory? I think that's not easy. We've had lots of cases where people take the money, or with sourcing contracts. Somebody on the call today, I remember we had it, and they just didn't perform, and so it's not easy. You can write them a letter, but if they don't transfer the money, it's difficult. It's time. So you might have a cash flow problem, even if you've got the world's greatest case. Even if you go back in time, rewrite the contract. The contract is not as good as having a dependable supplier, and that's why the due diligence is important. But the contract's important to help you work it out. But don't take crazy risks. Don't do a contract with H&M that will bankrupt your company because you feel that you will immediately get the money from the Chinese factory. That would be a poor business decision, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. So number 2 was know your supplier. Definitely do the due diligence about that. So let's just move on to the final section here, Mark. So these are, I guess, some more I guess outside of just the traditional sourcing issues that a lawyer might usually see, but here we'll just go through them one by one. I guess we'll start with procurement fraud. I know we have some percentages here, but I'm interested to hear if this has been your experience, being in China for 20 plus years.
Almost 30, sure. But I think the percentages you have to take very much with a grain of salt, because I just came up with these as a bit of a joke. And so, the thing was about procurement fraud. And, I think this came about because people were talking about like, oh, it's no problem. We have an expatriate procurement team, or our general manager is an expatriate. And what I had found was that that the expatriates were just as corrupt or as not corrupt as local Chinese employees. And so I just just as a bit of a joke said something like 10% of expatriates in the procurement team are very corrupt. 20% are corrupt to some degree. 30% are honest, and you just can't corrupt them. And then 40% haven't been around long enough in China. And so I think, part of it's not a China issue. It's the fact that I think in, supply chains, you've seen a lot of people have seen the like local Chinese suppliers become very rich. And, it's always about who you see every day. So when people were poor and you felt rich, it felt okay. But when you started seeing the Chinese suppliers were, driving bigger cars and there's bigger money, a lot of these people were feeling quite left out. So I think, the reason why procurement fraud's a big issue in China is not because of something uniquely Chinese. It's because there's a lot of procurement in China and there's a lot of money involved. And the more money involved and the bigger it is, the more corruption. And so I think, things which I would worry about is kickbacks. I think if you don't have your overseas team discussing occasionally with the factories or whatever, this is where some of the problems are. Because almost all of our issues when we've got clients who've got procurement fraud, it is a Chinese factory that is so keen to reach out to headquarters to say, your guys are asking for kickbacks. Because firstly, the factory doesn't want to do it. It puts them at risk, all these kind of things. So, that's the issue.
So how would you, if you wanted to give some advice, maybe some preventative advice, what kind of safeguards do you usually want to see to avoid this procurement fraud?
Well, it's not easy. I think, having the internal audit team from overseas come over occasionally, moving around, checking, if your procurement team, if the head of the procurement team, came from Nanjing and all your suppliers come from Nanjing and they're all about his age, that might be something that might be a red flag. Keep an ear open for things. I think, if there's any corruption somewhere, people know about it overseas. It's people have mentioned it, even if it's the general managers are corrupt, be it a foreigner, be it a Chinese person, whatever, head office knows, but they don't want to know because they would prefer the easy life of, as long as and so they don't take action until it becomes a real problem. And I think, if you're like particularly a US company and you're listed, you've got all kinds of potential, risks of not taking action. So I think, training is kind of important, but I wouldn't rely on people just signing a document that, I'm not corrupt, but it has to be a bit more sophisticated and, occasionally do, a check of things and reach out to your factories without your procurement team.
And so this next one is force majeure, which has kind of been at least for us, Mark, this was something that we thought about during the onset of COVID. But of course, COVID has kind of changed its shape in many forms. And that's why in the beginning, I wanted to mention the ports and the electricity and all these other, and the shortage of labor, all of these things kind of stem from the common root of COVID, right? So, I've heard you, kind of give your thoughts before on force majeure clause in the contract, and maybe you can just share some thoughts on, what have you, like the different types of scenarios that you've seen, and what are the, and just what are the principles behind force majeure, and maybe some of the actual practicalities of exercising the clause.
Yeah. So I think it's been a bit of a disappointment to our disputes team. We thought there'd be all these force majeure claims, but it hasn't really panned out. There was a case where I think all the oil companies in China were trying to get out of some oil contracts. That would have been like, I don't know how long COVID's been around, but it was like early on, maybe early 2020 or something.
Yeah.
And that was like big. That was the big guys, and about price increases, which you wouldn't think is normally a force majeure. We've got inflation now in the West. We've got, the Evergrande, was it Evergreen? Whatever.
Evergrande, yeah.
Evergreen, the ship that
Yeah.
botched up the Suez. It was Evergreen, I think. So you had all these kind of things which affected it, but we haven't seen that many cases. I think our disputes people are saying that normally it takes time for cases to come out. And so at the moment, people are coming out of this hibernation, and they're probably looking more to have the money to start the case. So you don't often start cases when you're desperate. It's normally when you've got a case and you feel that your business can absorb the cost of litigation. So I think with force majeure, you have to look into it, have to be careful about using it. And, it's something that, if we're going up against a Chinese supplier, I would normally first see if there's a way of dealing with it, because litigation's expensive. It's always difficult. But force majeure is often used as well from people to get out of contracts, So I think, that'll be the question people have asked. But in a nutshell, at least we haven't seen as many force majeure cases as we thought. I think, in our disputes team in London, we saw like 2 or 3 questions in the last 2 years. I thought there's going to be like 2 or 3 a week. I thought it was going to be just a treasure trove of cases, but not so many.
But I assume for a lot of companies who suffer some hardships, especially during the early parts, and maybe even now because of the ports and the electricity, whatever, the idea of the force majeure is probably still, in their minds, whether or not they understand the entire concept of it all. But I guess the one thing that I kind of want to I thought was interesting out of all these bullet points here is the second one, Mark. It's just that it's important to understand that even if you have a successful force majeure argument, that it does not grant carte blanche unilateral power over the terms of the contract. So I think that a lot of companies, or not a lot of companies, but a lot of people might, especially non-lawyers, might think that this is kind of like the ace in the hole. This, if we pull out and we successfully argue the force majeure, well then, the whole contract becomes void and null, and they'll get us out of this mess. But I guess what is that force majeure, I guess, concept, like from a legal perspective? You don't need to get very detailed, but just from a legal perspective, is it not really just the ace in the hole for companies? Maybe just give a reality check to them.
Yeah, so I think, but most people don't really think about the force majeure clause. They just use some template wording. But I often will look at the force majeure clause. I'm particularly proud of my construction contract force majeure clause in Shanghai, because force majeure in a supply contract, if it's a small delay or something, these are the issues. But in construction, what I was really worried about was, if the contractor could just argue that he couldn't do something, and it's easy to do this. So the force majeure clause we put in our construction contracts had things like the earthquake level in Shanghai, the rain, and we picked things, so very objective standards that have never been reached in Shanghai in 100 years. And then I did write "and," which I guess would never have been upheld, but it would have been like, you could only say it was force majeure if there was an earthquake, there was this tornado, typhoon, if there was this amount of rain, if the temperature was above that temperature. So, so I think it's important. Yeah, I think the problem with force majeure is as well, it's normally a stoppage, and stoppages don't last forever. So that's one issue. And then the second one is most people like to use it is when something's changed that doesn't make it that attractive. So the price has gone up and they want to get out of it, they're the supplier. And this is not really what force majeure is. It doesn't protect you from getting a lower price if you could renegotiate. So I think that's the problem with force majeure clauses.
So some of the other obligations will probably still continue, even if you have a good force majeure argument, which is very unlikely, like Mark said. We have just a few more slides here, so I want to get through them. Now, this one, Mark, it might seem that it's not directly related to China, but in a way, it's kind of a, we put this in here because we think this might be a future trend. And this is, what I'm talking about here is the German Supply Chain Act. So for anyone who's seen our previous episodes, what we normally like to do is kind of forecast, what China may do based off of what other countries are implementing in their own supply chains or GDPRs or all of the other different types of areas. So Mark, maybe you can explain the concept of why did we want to include the German Supply Chain Act in this presentation?
Well, I don't think the Chinese government is going to start doing a compliant supply chain act or something. So I think that's a bit different. I think here the issue is, Germany's doing this kind of social standards worldwide. So you could say they're exporting, their standards, which I can understand could upset people who are outside of Germany or European Union. But I think, firstly, normally where Germany goes, often Europe will follow. So if you look at the green dot, which was a German thing, when that first came out, people thought that's a weird kind of thing on the thing. And now I think it's everywhere in Europe, is that kind of recyclable type stuff, recycling requirement. And so I think, what they refer to minimum international standards. So you don't need to meet German, standards on, forced labor or things like that, or environmental protection requirements. But there are international treaties which are reflected on things, but also to meet the country. Like, so if it's China, the supplier has to meet the Chinese environmental requirements. So maybe 20 years ago, there was a lot more, hanky-panky with environmental standards. But now in China, it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough on environmental standards. We've got clients who reach out trying to get around the environmental standards by trying to operate their factories more than they're allowed to, etc. And the Chinese authorities, even in like fourth-tier areas, they don't like that, and also moving that stuff. So I think why I think it's interesting is, firstly, it's not on the slide here. There's a few issues. First issue is it will have big teeth. So I think it's 4% of your revenue if you, the German authorities can, sue you. A bit like the Chinese PIPL as well. Other people have standing. So it's not just the government. Trade unions can take action. Other groups with an interest can take action. So I think we're going to see, there's a lot of like activist type people around in the world now. So, this will be a weapon that people can use if they're upset about something. So I think that's important. I think the other thing is, if you look at the sourcing relationship between Europe and China, we all talk about also when we talk about, doing business in China, we're mostly talking about people setting up, businesses. But the trade relationship is so much bigger than the investment relationship. So, I think it was like 2 years ago, the amount of money between Europe and China in trade was over €1 billion a day. So it's real money, it's a massive thing. And so I think a lot of these German companies, and then in time, probably European companies, they have these sourcing relationships in China, and they will no longer be able just to rely on people saying, oh, I think they're okay. They wrote me a letter that they're okay. I think they're going to have to show that they've done due diligence, and that they've made a bit of an effort to do things. And so where we see, perhaps the opportunity is maybe that German company has 20 suppliers in China. That might not be cost effective for them to do 20 of these things in China, but each of those Chinese suppliers probably has 50 overseas customers. So one of the ideas that we want to kick off at the maybe end of the year is to talk to Chinese suppliers who supply to Europe and say, look, this is how we can help you become, more compliant. So we would actually do a package so they can show their overseas customers they are sustainable, they are transparent. And I think this is something which is coming. I think even without these laws, big companies will want to be able to show that they're compliant. There's that whole ESG stuff. There's activist shareholders coming out. So I think, people will want to be able to show that they've got a resilient but green and transparent and sustainable and compliant supply chain.
Yeah. And this is the last two slides here, but they both talk about the green initiatives behind the supply chain. And well, I just put here a recent example in July of this year that Cainiao, which is Alibaba's logistics arm, and Nestle agreed to team up to perform a wide variety of just ways to improve the green I guess the green supply chain. So it includes revamping operations, production lines, warehousing, distribution. It goes on, and even Nestle will use the algorithms to forecast and use the appropriate size packaging when they're delivering products, and also to reduce waste. So this is, and they'll also even pick it up, the waste from you at no cost. So this is kind of an interesting take. And some the points on the bullet points on the left, regardless of at least this was a take I had, and Mark, just let me know if you disagree, but it seems like regardless of there is a big opportunity there, just because this is kind of an initiative that I think everyone can get behind. This goes beyond any types of politics. It goes beyond even like COVID or anything like that. I mean, just making sure that that there is ways to kind of not be so wasteful and create a more sustainable supply chain is an area that has been ignored for a long time, and there can definitely be room for improvement. So Mark, just if you want to give us your final thoughts, you only have about 5 minutes, but if you want to just give us
maybe plastics companies wouldn't like it, but I think China, you can see how they move in things, and if you look at like how it used to be 10 years ago, so I think people have identified, like you say, there's a lot of wasteful packaging, there's a lot of stupidity in the system, and China is able to move things quickly and require stuff like in Shanghai, I think used to be able to throw anything out, and then like 2 years ago they brought in like a German style sorting of your rubbish, and they were able to get that up and running very quickly, so nobody knew how to get rid of their old chairs or anything anymore. So I think it's something that's going to come. So so I think I'm betting that compliance is becoming more important for Chinese companies, and they just won't want the hassle of being non-compliant or having problems with their customers. They just want to, supply the contract, get paid, and continue. That's
And this is the last slide here, but I just want to. I was even today doing some more research before the presentation, and on the left are some couple of different examples of like 11 specific green initiatives. Cainiao, the Alibaba logistics arm, is actually going to, or maybe already has, have package recycling across its stations in 20 cities, 10,000 stations, just for the holiday to recycle and reduce the carbon footprint of packaging. Tmall has dedicated $15 million worth of coupons for green electronics and other types of products. And also Tmall has been working with Unilever, L'Oreal to reduce the plastic and create just a more eco-friendly products. Mark, just one last question here. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark, before I ask the question from the chat?
No,
Okay.
no.
I thought it's really cool, and I think it's to me, I think my takeaway from doing some of that research is that I think this is probably going to be the future. Like I don't expect this to be 11/11/2021, and then next year it's not going to be this way. Like I think what we're seeing is probably, like you said, this is probably just the beginning stages of a trend. And so if you wanted to possibly work with Tmall or Alibaba for the 11/11, for example, even something as small as just a small, I don't want to say it's like a minor push, but like if you want to do even for something for one holiday, you probably will have more success if you actually incorporate some of these ideas into your own supply chain and your products. So with that said, Mark, this is the last question from the chat. How serious does the present energy situation in China? Some manufacturers cannot produce every day, and there might be shortages in some raw materials such as magnesium and aluminum. I don't know how much you can speak to that, but if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. So I think we've got a lot of manufacturing clients, and people have mentioned, they asked some questions about it, but nobody has actually experienced a blackout or a shortage that they had to stop their production. So I think I guess it's serious. I've seen that there was a lot of work by different chamber of commerce about the brownouts, I think they call them, rather than a blackout. But I don't think we're going to see much because, like I said, we didn't have that many force majeure cases from COVID. And I think this is probably less serious than the COVID, where workers couldn't get to the factories, and then the logistics was even more screwed up. So, yeah, it's not nice, but I think it's nothing compared to what we had, and what we had didn't result in a lot of legal disputes. So I think people will somehow keep calm and carry on, I think.
Yeah, maybe just a short-term problem. All right, well, thanks a lot, Mark, for your time, and thanks everybody for watching. Once again, I will send everybody who registered on the Eventbrite page a copy of this presentation, along with the YouTube link. So if there was any questions that maybe we skipped over or anything like that, you could also email that to us, or just go ahead and watch the recording. All right, well, thanks a lot, Mark. See you next time.
Thank you. See you.
And thanks a lot, everybody. All right.